Hold on to this number while I walk you through everything that has happened around the Cleveland Browns this week. 3 days. That's how long voluntary minicamp ran before the narrative machine surrounding this franchise completed what I can only describe as one of the most disorienting full rotations I've witnessed around an NFL roster situation in recent memory. 3 days of helmets and shorts, no pads, no contact, no live defense, no film that any serious football evaluator would treat as a meaningful competitive sample. And somehow, in that window, both Shedeur Sanders and Dillon Gabriel ended up reportedly on the trade market simultaneously. Anthony Richardson was being floated as a target Cleveland should genuinely pursue, and certain local media voices arrived at the public position that Shedeur Sanders doesn't even deserve to be this team's backup quarterback. Not the starter, the backup. I want to walk through all of it carefully. The narratives, the actual football reality, the trade speculation, and what I genuinely believe is happening inside that facility when the cameras aren't manufacturing the next story. Let me start with the pattern that has followed Shedeur Sanders, because understanding how that pattern has evolved is essential to understanding what's happening right now. When he was moving through the pre-draft process, the criticism was about the tape. Then people actually watched the tape, and that argument became harder to sustain convincingly. So it migrated. It moved to the combine environment, to private interview concerns, to character questions that circulated with real authority in certain media spaces but could never be named specifically or supported with anything resembling documented evidence. Then, Shedeur spent an entire year inside the Cleveland building. He operated in a situation that was measurably and demonstrably not configured to support his development. He survived it. His character stayed intact. His professional reputation didn't take a single credible, specific hit, despite being in daily proximity to a local media ecosystem that would clearly benefit professionally from finding something damaging to attach to his name. After a full year of that proximity, they found nothing, because there is nothing to find. So where does the conversation go from there? What argument remains after every previous angle has been exhausted? Apparently the answer is his last name. That's genuinely where we've arrived. A year ago, the argument was that he got drafted as high as he did because of his father's influence and the attention surrounding the Sanders name. Now the argument, from some of the same voices, is that he fell as far as he did in the draft because of the complications surrounding everything around the Sanders name. I want you to actually think about that for a second. Both of those arguments cannot be true at the same time. They cannot. If his name inflated his draft position, it cannot simultaneously have suppressed it. The narrative adjusted itself between those two moments to reach whatever conclusion was convenient at that specific time, and reasoning that works backwards from a predetermined destination rather than forward from available evidence is not analysis. It is advocacy operating under the cover of analysis. That distinction is everything, and recognizing it clearly is the only way to properly understand the Cleveland media coverage that Monken made the structural decision to exclude from his preparation environment. I want to give Dillon Gabriel the honest treatment this conversation almost never provides him, because fairness requires it regardless of where the competitive evaluation has landed. He is a third-round draft pick. That is not a trivial investment of organizational capital. It represents a meaningful commitment of draft resources that a general manager operating with Andrew Berry's documented approach to asset management does not simply walk away from without exploring what the market might return. When reports indicate the Browns are still evaluating Gabriel's role and haven't completely closed the door on his organizational future, that is not an endorsement of him as a competitive solution at quarterback. It is an accurate description of how a competent front office manages an asset it has already spent meaningful capital acquiring. The question of where Gabriel ultimately lands is genuinely open, and treating it as completely resolved before padded practices have begun is precisely the kind of premature conclusion manufacturing that has characterized this entire coverage cycle from the moment minicamp opened. What is not open is the direct assessment from people who actually watched both quarterbacks compete. Josh Cribbs played professional football at a high level. He understands what winning looks like from inside a competitive environment and has no professional stake in advocating for one player over another. He was unambiguous about what he observed. Gabriel has used whatever opportunity this building was going to make available to him. He is not the talent this situation requires. Shedeur outperformed him. That is a football person speaking honestly from first-hand competitive observation, not someone running a narrative agenda. When Cordell Stewart, a quarterback who performed at the game's highest level, who broke records at the position, who understands what it actually requires from the inside, arrives at the same conclusion independently and states it plainly, you are not hearing noise. You are hearing legitimate football evaluation converging from separate directions on the same honest destination. The people still manufacturing reasons to keep this competition artificially open are the ones whose specific interests are served by that artificial uncertainty. Now, I need to address the Anthony Richardson trade speculation directly, because this is where the conversation moved from premature to genuinely disconnected from football reality, and I think it deserves a clear and honest response rather than just a dismissal. The proposal being circulated is that Cleveland should move Shedeur Sanders and draft capital to Indianapolis to acquire Richardson. Let me ask you to actually think through what the resulting quarterback room would contain, because examining it clearly makes the proposal very difficult to defend on pure football grounds. You would have Deshaun Watson, whose physical situation carries genuine uncertainty about how many games he can sustain as a primary starter without interruption across a full season. You would have Taylon Green, who is widely acknowledged as a player still in the very early foundational stages of his professional development. And you would have Anthony Richardson, who despite possessing genuinely remarkable physical tools has struggled with consistency, missed significant time to injury, and carries a documented history in which his relationship with the full technical and psychological demands of the quarterback position has raised legitimate questions from professional evaluators who have watched him at close range over multiple seasons. That is the quarterback room being advocated for. That is what trading a 5th overall pick is supposed to obtain for this franchise. When you actually lay it out with that clarity, the proposal reveals itself as something other than a football argument. The Richardson speculation also exposes something revealing about what certain corners of this media conversation are actually optimizing for. Richardson is a content engine. His arm talent is real and dramatic. His athleticism produces highlight moments that travel across platforms and generate immediate engagement in ways that Shedeur's more systematic, timing-based operational style doesn't replicate with the same visual immediacy. But we are supposed to be evaluating quarterbacks for their capacity to help franchises win football games consistently across long competitive periods, not for their capacity to generate the most shareable moments in a weekly news cycle. When you apply that standard honestly, and without filtering it through content value, the case for Richardson over Sanders is nowhere near as obvious as the volume of the speculation suggests. One player has demonstrated the kind of competitive intelligence and operational precision that winning offenses require as their foundation. The other has demonstrated a physical ceiling that generates excitement every spring and produces real questions every October. The Pittsburgh trade scenario involving Shedeur deserves more serious engagement than a simple dismissal, because it presents a genuinely more nuanced picture that requires honest examination. The framing, that Shedeur could develop quietly behind Aaron Rodgers in a lower-pressure environment while building toward a future starting opportunity, has real surface appeal that I understand. Development timelines benefit from the right surrounding conditions, and a veteran presence with Rodgers' experience and football intelligence can be a genuinely valuable resource for a young quarterback learning the professional game. But Pittsburgh also has Drew Aller and Will Howard on their roster. Two quarterbacks their own fan base has real emotional investment in seeing developed and given real opportunities. The scenario of Shedeur arriving there and settling into a clean, quiet developmental role behind Rodgers, while two other organizational quarterback investments compete for the same resources and attention, is considerably more complicated in practice than the simplified version of the story presents. And more fundamentally, the Cleveland Browns spent the 5th overall selection in an NFL draft on Shedeur Sanders. The organizational commitment embedded in that decision is not something a well-functioning front office responsibly dissolves through a trade motivated more by external narrative fatigue than by any honest football evaluation of what this player can genuinely provide across the next decade. The Michael Penix situation adds a layer of genuine roster complexity that the current coverage cycle is almost completely ignoring, and I think it matters more than the trade speculation volume suggests. Reports indicate Penix is unlikely to be available for training camp and may not be ready to participate meaningfully until approximately week 3 of the preseason at the earliest. That creates a real and practical organizational need for quarterback bodies in the building during the early stages of camp, completely independent of what the ultimate depth chart resolution ends up looking like, which means Gabriel potentially remaining on the roster initially serves a legitimate functional purpose that has nothing to do with any longer-term evaluation of his standing in this competition. The same reporting being cited in one part of this conversation as evidence that Gabriel is heading elsewhere can simultaneously and accurately be cited as evidence that the Browns see operational value in having him present during the early stages of camp. Both things can coexist within a front office managing multiple competing variables across a compressed offseason timeline. That kind of nuance gets completely obliterated when the media coverage is operating at the velocity and volume that the Cleveland situation has been producing since minicamp opened. The conversation about importing veteran wide receiver presence to stabilize this passing game tells its own revealing story about the selective attention being applied to this roster. Those discussions have unfolded almost entirely without any serious examination of what Jerry Jeudy actually produced last season, specifically that he was statistically among the least effective players in the league at his position in terms of dropped footballs. He is already on this roster. He is precisely the veteran receiver presence that these conversations describe as essential to organizational passing game stability. He delivered the opposite of what veteran presence is supposed to contribute. The same voices calling for imported receiver stability constructed that entire argument without accounting for the veteran receiver who was already in the building and who represents a significant part of the problem being described. That selective attention is not coincidental or accidental. It runs in exact parallel to the selective attention that has characterized the coverage of Shedeur's situation throughout. Highlight the things that build the story you want to tell. Systematically set aside the things that complicate or contradict it. Here is the actual football picture heading into training camp, stated as clearly and honestly as I know how to state it. Shedeur Sanders has demonstrated in the limited and structurally compromised circumstances he has operated within that he belongs in this competition and that the coaching staff currently running this building agrees he belongs in it. Watson faces genuine physical uncertainty that any honest projection accounts for rather than strategically sets aside to serve a preferred narrative. Gabriel has been evaluated by multiple credible football people who watched the minicamp sessions directly and arrived at the same conclusion from independent starting points without coordination or agenda. The organizational infrastructure assembled this offseason, the offensive line investments, the specific receiver additions, the philosophical framework Monken has articulated publicly about what his offense demands and what winning football actually requires at the head coaching level, all of it points toward a specific operational style at the quarterback position. The quarterback whose game is most aligned with that style is the one whose name keeps appearing in trade speculation, not because the football evidence supports moving him, but because certain people in this conversation would find it considerably more convenient if he were no longer in the building presenting daily evidence against the narrative they've spent substantial time and professional credibility constructing. What I genuinely believe happens when training camp opens and the evaluation resumes under real competitive conditions is not complicated. Shedeur brings the same daily preparation quality and competitive consistency that the coaches inside that building have already been accumulating as genuine evaluative evidence for weeks. The preseason games provide actual competitive film that non-contact minicamp sessions in helmets and shorts simply cannot generate, and that film gets incorporated into an evaluation being conducted by a staff that arrived in Cleveland with zero organizational loyalty to any previous regime and zero motivation to shield anyone from what real competitive evidence honestly reveals. That evaluation has had a direction for some time. The formal announcement is the only element that remains pending. No amount of trade speculation manufactured in a 3-day non-contact window changes what happens when real competition resumes under conditions that produce unambiguous results. What the Cleveland coverage generated this week is, whatever its intentions, the most complete possible justification for why Monken closed the facility doors in the first place. The available competitive evidence was genuinely limited. 3 days of non-contact work that no serious football evaluator treats as a foundation for decisions of this magnitude. The media response was to manufacture a complete trade market speculation cycle, publicly question the roster standing of a 5th overall pick on backup quarterback grounds, and produce arguments from the same voices who spent the previous year establishing precisely how they intended to approach covering this particular player when circumstances gave them the opportunity. Running the full narrative revolution before a single padded practice has been conducted is not journalism in any meaningful sense of what that word is supposed to represent. It is content generation operating in the space where patient, honest, evidence-based observation is supposed to live. The people conducting the actual evaluation inside that building are not on the media's timeline and are not making decisions based on what 3 days of helmets and shorts produced in the coverage ecosystem. They have already seen enough across weeks of real observation to understand what they have. Everything that follows is the process of confirming it under conditions where the conclusion, when it finally comes, cannot be credibly disputed by anyone willing to look honestly at the evidence that produced it.